Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar co-hosted by the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility and the Investment Integration Project, also known as TIIP, in support of the launch of TIIP's Systemic Stewardship Guide on Investing to Address Income Inequality. My name is Stephanie Lavallato, an Associate Program Director at ICCR, and I'll be moderating today's event. We'll be starting today's webinar with some introductory remarks on income inequality and systemic stewardship from Josh Zinner, CEO of ICCR, followed by an overview of key findings from TIIP's new Systemic Stewardship Guide, presented by J.R. Bascom, an associate at TIIP. We'll then hold a moderated discussion with a panel of experts on how investors can use these systemic stewardship approaches to address income inequality, and we'll end with about 15 minutes of Q&A. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and will be circulated to registered attendees after the event. And to help us out with the Q&A session at the end, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to drop questions throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can during that session. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh to kick things off.
Thank you, Stephanie. And first of all, thanks to all the panelists for joining, and a special thanks to the Investment Integration Project for their partnership and good work. Unfortunately, and it's not news to everyone on this call, that income inequality is getting worse and worse and is really virtually unchecked in this era. So for example, where the world's richest 1% have more than twice as much wealth as nearly 90% of the people in the world combined, we're facing some really catastrophic situation, and the pandemic has only worsened this divide, obviously. Given the central role of investors and corporations in the economic system, it's really incumbent upon the investor community to understand our own role in fostering income inequality and to seek ways to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. For 50 years, ICCR members, who now number more than 300 institutional investors, faith and values-based investors in the US and globally, for 50 years now, our members have been engaging as shareholders with corporations on their environmental and social impacts. What's unique about ICCR is that the dialogues with companies are not just about enhancing long-term shareholder value, but are really centered on the impact that corporate policies and practices have on people, community, and the planet. Fortunately, there's a growing number of investors who are following suit and really pushing companies to be accountable for their externalities, pushing corporations on the way their policies and practices contribute to systemic risks like income inequality, climate change, and threats to democracy. At the same time, there's a growing conversation among investors who are seeking to understand how their own investments can lead to systemic risk and how to change that. We're proud to partner with TIIP and this excellent panel on the webinar as they really discuss and explore TIIP's critically important new report that provides a framework and tools for investors to think both about systemic stewardship as a framework and specifically how they and their investments can address income inequality. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie. Again, thanks to everyone for attending today.
Thank you, Josh, for that overview to help set the tone for today's discussion. And with this framing in mind, we'll now pass the mic to JR to dive into TIIP's Systemic Stewardship Guide on addressing income inequality.
Thanks, Stephanie and Josh. As mentioned, my name is J.R. Bascom, and I'm an associate at TIIP. And I'd first like to echo our excitement to have you all joining us on the webinar today. As Josh and Stephanie mentioned, I'm here to give you a bit of background on the guide, its findings, and implications moving forward before turning it over to our group of great, dare I say, brilliant panelists. Next slide. To start, I think it's important to understand who TIIP is. TIIP was founded in 2015 by Steve Leidenberg and William Burkhart on the idea that investors needed to move beyond a portfolio focus and focus on entire systems. TIIP is an applied research and consulting services firm, providing thought leadership, implementation advice, and a plug-and-play solutions for integrating system-level investing. At a high level, TIIP looks to provide investors with advice and tools to navigate system-level investing. Now, system-level investing, broadly speaking, includes the adoption of new techniques that are explicitly designed to help investors influence social and financial systems and limit broadly occurring undesirable outcomes from the outset. These tools stress collaborative action, building shared knowledge bases, setting industry standards, and creating a rising tide of investment opportunities for all investors. They also focus on key leverage points that can strengthen overall social and financial systems, enhance their resilience, and ensure long-term stability. Next slide. Now, all that brings us to why we are here today. Over the past year or so, with funding from the Generation Foundation, TIIP has been working to outline practical steps for investors to redirect financial strategies to address one of these system-level issues, which is income inequality. This culminated in the writing and release of the guide, Systemic Stewardship, Investing to Address Income Inequality, co-authored by William Burkhart, Mike Musaraka, Steve Leidenberg, and myself. This report provides practical guidance for the implementation of system-level investing, while simultaneously building the wider market for system-level investing among the industry. It trains investors with the best practices to date to address systemic risks, while pushing the industry as a whole to change. And it provides a roadmap forward for multiple issues, using income inequality as an example, but providing a process that can be extended to other systemic issues, like climate change or public health crises. More specifically, systemic stewardship helps investors modify conventional investment tools and utilize advanced techniques to address income inequality through action on labor and workers' rights, CEO compensation, and taxes. It takes investors through a 6-step process created by TIIP's founders in their book released in 2021. Titled 21st Century Investing, Redirecting Financial Strategies to Drive Systems Change. Next slide, please. So why is this report focused on income inequality? And even further, why should investors care? There is an argument that a certain amount of income inequality can be good for society. It can incentivize hard work and encourage entrepreneurship. However, today's extreme income inequality does more harm than good. It slows economic growth, leads to more frequent and deeper recessions, limits upward mobility, aggravates social cohesion, and exacerbates political polarization. In particular, women and racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately harmed. Now, at its most basic level, income inequality is a destabilizing force, and instability hinders effective long-term investing. This dramatic level of income inequality subjects society and investors to a substantial systemic risk, one that affects all investments across all asset classes. Next slide, please. While governments play a fundamental role in addressing income inequality, investors maintain a unique ability to leverage their capital and influence to be an integral part of the response. Anyone can say there's a problem. The key is providing a solution. Systemic stewardship, a term coined by TIIP in this report, provides this solution. Systemic stewardship expands on the traditional view of stewardship as the safeguarding and nurturing of assets. It adds to this concept to preserve and enhance the fundamental social and environmental systems that underpin wealth-creating potential of assets. It acknowledges investors' obligation to manage the financial worth of their portfolios, but also calls on them to mitigate risks to underlying systems as well. In taking this approach, it considers, for example, the ability of specific asset classes to mitigate systemic risk and create systemic social and environmental benefits. It also leverages advanced techniques that help investors to, for instance, call attention to public policy debates about governmental rules and regulations that can positively or negatively impact their exposure to risks at system levels. Next slide, please. Now, what does this new version of stewardship look like in practice? To start, and as outlined in the report, the first step in an investor's decision to integrate systemic considerations into the investment process is setting a goal around a systemic issue, in this case, income inequality. A goal that will eventually affect their investments across all asset classes. Beyond building efficient portfolios and addressing social and environmental challenges, as conventional and sustainable investors have done for many years, those choosing to take a system-level approach will seek to influence income inequality themselves in ways that can generate positive impacts from the outset, benefiting all investors' returns in the long run. Next slide, please. Next, investors must decide where to focus and to commit to addressing a certain systemic issue. In addition to incorporating risk, return, and systemic challenges into their decision-making process, this guide offers system-level investors 4 additional criteria to consider when determining where to focus and in turn how to come to the conclusion of focusing on income inequality. These 4 criteria include consensus, which is a general agreement among authorities on the issue's relevance to investors, which is the potential for an issue to affect investors' portfolios positively or negatively. The third is potential for investors' policies and practices to effectively impact or influence the issue at a system level. And the last is uncertainty about the potential outcomes caused by disruptions related to the system level issue that cannot be addressed through traditional portfolio risk management techniques. All 4 criteria apply to income inequality. Next slide, please. After deciding where to focus, investors must allocate their assets accordingly. The guide directs investors to consider the ability of specific asset classes to mitigate the systemic risk stemming from income inequality and create benefits from addressing this systemic issue. For example, fixed income can naturally create public goods when issued by governments. Public equities are well suited to influence incremental change in large firms. Venture capital is a disruptor of business models and services, and so on with other asset classes. Next slide, please. Once these considerations are made, investors can integrate this focus into their traditional investment tools from a company and portfolio focus to the broader context of industries and systems. To begin with, investors may already publicly state their beliefs about the efficiency of the markets. But for income inequality, investors can specify their belief in long-term value of the stability of social systems upon which they depend. Such statements can be helpful and shift the fundamental mindset of the investment community. Next, they can construct portfolios that not only de-emphasize companies with histories of poor labor practices and possibly engage with them, but they can also set standards for entire industries, such as footwear and apparel. Next slide, please. Investors can also leverage advanced techniques described in this guide to address income inequality, tools that are specifically designed to manage systemic risks and rewards. These techniques can be grouped accordingly to 3 broad overarching strategies and tactics: field building, investment enhancement, and opportunity generation, all of which illuminate the path forward for the practice of system-level investing. First, investors start working more effectively and collectively, which is field building. Then they change the way they make investments, investment enhancement. And finally, they create investment opportunities that will improve systems, opportunity generation. Next slide, please. After investors follow these 5 steps, they must answer the question, so what? To do so, they take the last and final step, which is evaluating results. In addition to traditional reports on portfolios, financial, and ESG performance, this guide offers investors a 6-part measurement framework for system-level investments related to a manager's beliefs and actions, and their effectiveness in various tasks and outcomes. In short, these 6 criteria help answer the following 3 questions. How can we know which financial products and services and which asset managers are truly addressing the major systemic challenges of our time? Second, who is simply insulating their portfolios from the adverse impacts of ever-increasing harm to our environment and society? And finally, who is serious about fighting income inequality or climate change or public health crises, as opposed to just engaging in greenwashing with misleading claims and empty gestures. Next slide, please. Now, the 6 steps of the process are all the same for all investors. And overall, this guide illustrates the need for and benefits of incorporating a system-level perspective at each step in the process. While this guide is focused on income inequality, the stewardship process herein gives investors the tools necessary to engage with other system-level challenges, such as climate change or other public health crises. This work is challenging and evolving, but Vanguard's system-level investors have provided this roadmap for others to follow. What's more, our panel today will detail how they are helping further advance investors' understanding of systemic stewardship to address income inequality, as well as related efforts to drive larger industry transformation. From SEIU's leading effort to integrate the focus into practice of systemic stewardship, to ICCR and Predistribution Initiative's development of a systemic stewardship member-led working group, to TIIP's soon-to-launch plug-and-play solution for integrating system-level investing in the establishment of a community of practice. Help is on the way. And with that, I'll pass it back to Stephanie.
Thanks so much, JR, for the preview of this discussion and for that overview of how income inequality is a systemic risk to the economy and investor portfolios, and what steps investors can take to address these system-level risks. And so this context sets us up well for today's panel discussion with 3 leaders on the topics of addressing income inequality and systemic stewardship. First, we have Renee Manley, Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Service Employees International Union, Bill Burkhart, President of the Investment Integration Project, and Delilah Rothenberg, Co-founder and CEO of the Predistribution Initiative. So thank you all so much for being here, and I'm excited to dig into the discussion today. To kick things off, I'd like to start with you, Renee, from the perspective of an investor and as an ICCR member. For those that might not be familiar with your work, can you first maybe share a bit of background on SEIU's work and where it's chosen to focus its efforts to address income inequality?
Sure. I just want to thank TIIP and ICCR for inviting SEIU to be a part of this really dynamic discussion today. For those who aren't familiar with the Service Employees International Union, we are a union of 2 million members who have plan participants in 55 public sector pension funds and 19 Taft-Hartley funds. And I lead our capital strategies work, and I also serve as a trustee on one of our funds. I think for us as a labor union, this whole work of systemic stewardship is just essential, right? We care about, the work of the responsible allocation of our members' money, right? Like that's my whole job. It's like working with our trustees and staff of pension funds, asset managers, to make sure that our members' retirement is secure and safe and invested in a responsible way. But our members want also to make sure that their money is not weaponized against them, right? They want to make sure that their money is invested in a way that respects the sanctity of the work that they do as public sector workers, as healthcare workers, as service workers, and respects their communities and the people that they work with every day. And that's really important to our members. We hear that all the time. So the whole concept for us is something that's essential to who we are and who our members are. The other important thing to note about SEIU is that we have members who serve as trustees on these funds. So they come to this in their stewardship ability from their identity as workers, right? And so this is something that in traditional investor world, they are supposed to separate their identity as workers from their identity as fiduciaries or trustees on the fund, and that really doesn't work in real life for folks, right? So the whole idea of systemic stewardship is really ingrained in how we want to approach our work, and I think our trustees actually have to fight to make sure that that happens in a way that's responsible, and often find themselves really a lot at odds with consultants and investment staff at the funds when they're trying to think through this, from a systemic viewpoint in their role as trustees. I think where we've really focused our work on income inequality has really been the focus on racial justice and racial equity. And we've tried to approach that from a kind of a very systemic viewpoint. It's been an opportunity for us to really educate trustees and the broader investment world about how you can approach this from a systemic stewardship point of view. What we've seen happen, right, is that post the George Floyd murder, $50 billion was pledged towards this, these diversity, equity initiatives out of the blue, just like practically overnight, with no accountability, no concept of how it impacts the long-term policies and practices, no concept of where the impact of these allocations and how they would land. How would these allocations contribute to the long-term sustainability for these corporations? And for us, it provided an opportunity, because how do you allocate that large amount of money? Investors have a lot of questions. These are the same companies, the same corporations who literally a year ago couldn't even find diverse people to sit on their boards. And now you want to tell your investors that you can find a way to allocate $50 billion to diversity, equity, and initiatives. It doesn't match up. And so what we've been doing is really utilizing this tool, calling for racial equity audits, civil rights audits, because those audits, as a shareholder tool, ask the companies to look at their company practices and policies and the impacts. It's not just a report on what you're doing, what your history of your giving, not just what your HR policies are, but really what the impacts are on impacted communities. And it engages stakeholders, and it provides an opportunity for outside third parties to come in and do the measurement, to engage with the company and stakeholders. And I think that's one way we have attempted to integrate systemic stewardship in an area of focus for SEIU.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that overview and sharing some of that great work on the racial equity and civil rights audits. It's a fantastic example of this systems level view and kind of embedding that across an organization instead of being siloed to one area of the business. And so you acknowledge how this lens, the systemic stewardship perspective, is kind of embedded in who SEIU is, and you did a great job of sharing that. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to SEIU's evolution of applying that systemic stewardship approach, perhaps in this example of the racial equity focus, kind of thinking about the steps that JR just laid out for us and the tools that investors have to apply this in practice.
I think just like everybody else, we had looked at it, from a very kind of siloed, functional viewpoint. If you would have asked me the same question 5 years ago. And income inequality is something that's very, that we wanted to focus on. I remember talking to, groups of investors, large pension funds, about how we could address income inequality. And, there's a lot of data on income inequality, and we would try to have these conversations, but there was no tool. There was no real work that we could engage in as our fund. And I think this is really important because, large funds may have some processes and resources to do this, but for a lot of smaller funds, it's a lot more difficult to pull that together. And so we had to look for something that would fit for a lot of our Taft-Hartley funds and some of our smaller funds that they could utilize, that don't have the same resources that maybe a CalPERS would have or a New York would have, right? So we had to think about what could fit in that could be utilized by our funds of all sizes. And there wasn't a tool, there wasn't anything that would really fit that all of our funds could use, that an analysis that all of our trustees could use. And I think that was missing. And so when we started out, we were really, thinking about like, how do we bring this, for instance, we could do things around specific resolutions or, talk about specific, asset classes that impacted income inequality. We did a lot of things on like fees and private equity and abuses and different asset classes, but we weren't tackling the problem itself. And I think our trustees were really coming to us and asking us the questions about, how is this change? They really were asking us, this may seem like a commercial, but they really were asking us, like, how are we changing the system? Like, how do we get to the core of the thing? Because that was the change that they wanted to see. And they wanted to be able to bring a change that could be transformative and not transactional. And that, I think that was the type of feedback that we were getting. And we wrestled with that a while. And so even though we continued to do work, in kind of that transactional, disaggregated way, we were always looking and thinking about how we could bring a more transformative and holistic viewpoint to the work that we were doing. And I think, we started to figure it out as we, connected with folks like Delilah and Bill and other folks who were also really, thinking in this manner. And so I think it all came together because we were looking for an opportunity to be, to approach this in a transformative way.
It's certainly a journey, and your experience highlights how there's many different levers to pull out there that address symptoms, but how do we think more holistically to make sure that this is transformative and systems level? And so,
and I just want to add one more thing, Stephanie. I think it also is like for us that we had every intention, and I think it was a willingness on our part as well.
Absolutely.
That also made a big difference. There's a lot of resistance out there. People are kind of, stuck in a methodology that has existed for a long time. But, we are spending a lot of time educating our trustees, and we have no problem disrupting the status quo with this new narrative because we think it's essential. Absolutely.
And I want to bring Bill and Delilah in here as well. So Bill, maybe you could share a bit from your lens over at TIIP about how this perspective that Renee has shared about kind of disrupting the system and their evolution of getting to this point, how that compares to what else you're seeing from investors who are seeking to address income inequality.
Yeah, and that was very helpful, Renee, because it makes my job easy. So I think the thing that I want to really focus in on, what Renee was basically articulating is like, look, this is really hard because it's super complicated, but it's doable. And I think that's the thing that we're starting to more and more see. And I know definitely Delilah and Predistribution Initiative, they've been influencing the ecosystem. There's other folks that are doing it. And you're seeing more of these examples popping up where people are not only connecting the fact that, hey, this requires a culture change, both in the financial system to do this work, but also at our specific institutions. It requires a rethink in how we do business and how we think about the types of techniques that we deploy, how ingrained that is into our policies and programs, and that it's going to, that you can't just do the same things that you were doing and expect a different result just because you call it systemic, right? So that's been part of this kind of learning journey that we at TIIP, in terms of how we've been thinking about this and crystallizing for folks, but also in terms of how we're seeing this type of focus manifest. And, the spoiler alert is, look, no one's totally nailed this yet. This is still fairly early days. We're seeing components throughout the report that JR was giving the overview on. We can point to, when it comes to getting started, CBIS, the Australian Construction Union, they have embedded this as part of their beliefs, that a focus on, it's not just integrating ESG as a risk mitigation tool, but really driving a more sustainable financial system. That's fundamental to how they think about things. We talk about how, deciding where to focus, that there's groups like CalPERS that really specifically call attention to these big issues, and they justify that focus. And then as you go through each of these steps, we highlight different investors that are taking pieces of this. So Jesse Smith Noyce Foundation, kind of $50 million social justice foundation based in New York. They did an advisor search, and they actually embedded, as part of their due diligence with that advisor search, questions around, how can, with our particular mission focus, how can we see that reflected in our investments, and how are you going to actually measure and track progress? Back to Renee's point, we can do a lot of different things, but unless we're proving that these things are actually having the impact or the influence that we think, then we run the risk of this just being another form of green or impact washing, right? So we're seeing components of this happening more and more. A lot of the kind of challenges that we're hearing from Renee, as well as the opportunities, these are getting reflected. We just are completing this big industry needs assessment where we looked at different segments of the investor community. And we think everybody on this call, I think, helped inform that. So we really appreciate that. But it was just that idea of really trying to get to the heart of, look, we're seeing bespoke, interesting activities happening, but how do we start to knit this together into a framework for action that all investors can use, and that they can use the fundamentals of it across these different issue areas? So we're seeing a lot of that progress. And I just think that it's one of those things where we need to tell more of Renee's story. We need to tell more of those stories. And I think, what you guys are attempting to do with Delilah and Predistribution Initiative around a systemic stewardship group, I think that's going to make that sharing of those best practices and knowledge so much more effective and much more useful to folks going forward. So I'll pause there.
Thanks so much for that, Bill. In summary, it does require this paradigm shift, but there's demand for this. And to your point, and hearing Renee's experience, there's a path forward, and we are creating the tools to see that through. And so I want to start with Delilah on this next question, but we've talked about the need to build an ecosystem here to enable investors and other players in the system to help move the needle on income inequality. So Delilah, can you speak a little bit first to who Predistribution Initiative is, but what you're doing to help create and build this ecosystem that's needed to make progress on this issue?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks everybody. It's good to be here. And there's so much to build on from what Renee and Bill said, as well as JR and Josh and your question, Stephanie. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, the Predistribution Initiative is a nonprofit. We started in early 2019 with a focus on how investment structures themselves, for instance, as Renee mentioned, certain private equity structures can lead to negative impacts when it comes to economic inequality for workers in the portfolio companies. Really started looking at those kinds of issues and recognizing that ESG and impact investing frameworks that have been developed, if we think about SASB or GRI or IRIS Plus, they're all very focused on the portfolio company activities, the operations of the portfolio companies, how they're treating their workers, how they're managing emissions, but they're not very focused on how the funds that invest in the portfolio companies are actually structured. And that can have a really big impact. So if you think about the executive compensation of fund managers, that can exacerbate inequality. And a lot of fund managers aren't publicly traded, so won't be evaluated by SASB. And we need to capture these impacts in the system. The framing of financial materiality when asset owners and allocators think about investing is very focused on the portfolio company level as well. It doesn't capture these systemic risks that are coming from investment structures, the distribution of returns, how different actors are compensated. the fees that might be charged to portfolio companies, the extraction that might be happening with portfolio companies in certain private equity structures. We're not saying this is the case in all private equity. We believe it plays a very important role in the economy and for small and growing businesses, or businesses that need help. But this is all very important to take into account. So we are developing tools and educational materials for asset owners and allocators to start to think about how these different issues manifest in their portfolios. I'll also say that the financial materiality lens does not capture a lot of systemic risks related to economic inequality at the portfolio company level either. So I saw this report last week, a few days ago. I've been wanting to dive into it some more, but it talks about the importance of quality benefits for workers in economic stability and economic growth. Economic growth, of course, is important, or at least stability is important for investors' portfolios because they're dependent on the health of the economy. And so even if offering benefits is not a material issue that investors are tracking at the portfolio company level, it does have an impact on performance ultimately at the portfolio level. And so all of this is really important. One initiative that I think is important to talk about is the Task Force on Inequality Related Financial Disclosures, or TIIP as we call it for short. Some people in the UK sort of default to TIFID, I think because it sounds like DFID, which was a development finance institution out in the UK, but we call it TIFD. You can call it TIFID if you want. It's being developed as a risk management framework to capture both how inequality impacts companies and investors' portfolios and returns, as well as how investors and companies affect inequality. So the inside out, outside in risks terminology you might have heard before be using. It is being designed to think about, to provide guidance to investors on how to think about targets and thresholds and where do we want to be, what does good look like? So it's not just a disclosure framework. To speak to the point Renee raised about all these companies have DEI pledges, like what's good and what's bad. And it's also being developed as a coalition centering the most marginalized and vulnerable. As opposed to a lot of other disclosure frameworks that have been developed, we're starting with some unlikely, uncommon coalition partners who haven't been part of the ESG and impact investing disclosure development world in the past. So the Interim Secretariat is a partnership of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, an academic institution in South Africa, as well as ROSI, a civil society organization in Argentina, ourselves, and Rights CoLab, who's also very active in the ICCR community. And we believe in that motto, nothing about us without us. And so as TIFD develops over the next few years, I talked a while, so if you want to hear the timeline, I can get into that, but I'll stop after this. But as it develops over the next few years, we plan to widen the coalition globally, invite grassroots organizations from both the global North and the global South, and make sure that that's developed in a really inclusive way. So that's TIFD. And then the last thing I'll say, we can go back to TIFD to talk about the timeline if we want, but the last thing I'll say is the Predistribution Initiative and the Investment Integration Project have also recognized another really important issue that you raised, Renee, and we talked about before, which is this, the stewardship teams of asset owners and allocators might be engaging companies and investors to do one thing, to support human capital, for instance, yet the investment teams are putting pressure on the companies and investors to magnify returns, sometimes through layering on excessive leverage, which can put the whole investment at risk. And workers at risk, and there are other financial engineering techniques that are not being captured. And so we are putting together tools and guidance on policies and procedures that can address that sort of those two dynamics that are sort of creating tension and preventing progress on holistically supporting our workers and communities.
Thanks so much for that overview, Delilah. Lots to unpack and lots more to discuss on TIFD and everything else. But one of you mentioned how there will be this need and opportunity to bring in impacted stakeholders into this process. And one of the things that we've learned in expanding and building this ecosystem and infrastructure to enable this systems level view is coalition building and capacity building among all stakeholders, not just investors and corporations, right? So I'm wondering if Renee or Bill have any other thoughts to add on how we bring in civil society, labor, frontline communities into this work, or experiences from your own engagements, Renee, to kind of bring this, people-centered approach to addressing income inequality.
Renee, do you want to go first?
Sure, Bill. I think this is something that has not been a part of the traditional framework with anything that I've experienced with investors. It's really novel for the corporate community, for the finance community to really take in input from stakeholders in a broader way. And so, as Bill mentioned, it's going to be an evolving process. We are kind of, shaking up the status quo, but I think it's really essential. The impact of climate, of income inequality, human capital risk on communities, on workers, on the planet. You have to take in and hear from impacted community stakeholders if we're going to really have solutions. If we're really going to mitigate risk, you have to hear from communities who are engaged, and people want to be heard. They want to offer and work in a collaborative way to mitigate these risks. And I don't think that anyone's intention is that these corporations shrivel up and die. I think what they want to do is see how they survive and sustain while eliminating these risks that cause harm to communities, workers, and to planet. And so the only way they're going to do that is if we have a dialogue. And so I think we're going to see more and more. And I hope that as we evolve from solutions like these racial equity audits, where in some form or fashion we're having these stakeholder engagements as a part of that process, it will provide some proof of concept that this is a viable way to resolve and to mitigate risk. And I think we've seen that with some of these other REAs that have been done, where if you talk to the companies, they will say that they were able to identify risks they would not have ordinarily recognized by engagement with community stakeholders. And I think we'll see the same thing as we engage on income inequality or any other issue. So I just think that they're missing out.
Yeah, and I would just build on that because I think it also gets to a question that Meredith Miller has posed around just general measurement and approaches to understanding system progress. Everything that Renee and Delilah are hitting on it really does get to this idea. We're not talking about complicated systems, we're talking about complex systems, that these things are inherently dynamic, and the way that we are going to engage them, depending on the system that's under stress, it's going to have different stresses. It's going to require different emphasis of activities and different ways of thinking, and to really understand the feedback loops between investors and the health of these systems and vice versa. So when we think about how do we measure these things most effectively, how do we construct these approaches to be most effective, for sure the voices of different key communities, including civil society, all the way down to the worker, all of these folks need to be part of this because they're helping to tackle different dimensions of whichever system under stress. TIIP had taken a stab at answering this kind of measurement and due diligence question in a couple of different ways. One of the things that we did was we started trying to identify indicators of systemic health. And so when we think about an issue like climate change, it's really a lack of adaptability. That's the problem in terms of how we are so dependent on fossil fuels as our primary energy driver. For income inequality, it's a lack of connectivity ultimately from the shareholders all the way down to the lowest paid worker. And each system has different types of indicators of systemic health. to solve those, to really start to tackle those leverage points that are unique to investors to really drive change and influence, you have got to have a constellation of voices that are part of that process, because the set of solutions that are going to be needed go well beyond just like, I'm going to construct a portfolio in this way, pick certain securities, and then call it a day. It goes well beyond that, because it speaks to the data infrastructure. It just speaks to the enabling environment from policy. It speaks to the ability for investors and these other key stakeholders to get together to share best practices and understand what drives real meaningful change on the ground. All of which I know everybody on this call are starting to tackle in different ways. But so it's a super important, and it really does fundamentally speak to our ability to really effectively measure and evaluate progress on this level.
Thanks for that context, Bill. And I recognize we're running short on time before we head over to the audience Q&A, but I want to kind of end with kind of thinking about if you're newer to this journey on either addressing income inequality or understanding how to do that, or bringing in this lens of systemic stewardship to your work as an investor. So I would love to do a first round of 60-second answers to, what advice would you give to an investor who's kind of just beginning this journey? And then we can highlight some additional opportunities for learning after that. But perhaps, Delilah, we'll start with you. What would you pose to an investor who wants to join in on this?
I really encourage you to get involved with TIFT. It is a learning process for all of us, and it's an opportunity to learn with us, to provide your input and knowledge and experiences. And it's going to take people with all different kinds of experiences, all parts of the ecosystem, to co-create together. So I see that. Thank you, Stephanie, for putting a link in the chat. This year, just as a heads up, we're co-creating an inclusive governance structure for TIFT with huge thanks to the support of the Tipping Point Fund on Impact Investing. And then next year, we expect to break up into working groups and map existing disclosures on inequality, synthesize where there's overlap, identify where there are gaps, close the gaps, produce guidance and a draft framework for release in 2024 for consultation, and then hopefully in 2025 have a pilot. But because this is an open process for everybody to learn in the interim, everybody can start taking the findings that are coming up throughout TIFT's co-creation and integrate it into your own due diligence questionnaires, or how you engage with companies, or what have you, your own policies and procedures and practices in the interim. So you don't have to wait until 2025 to start your journey on this.
Great, sounds like a very great hands-on learning experience. So, Renee, how about you? What advice would you give to an investor who's looking to get involved and start their journey in this work?
I would just say ask questions. If you're an investor, ask your fund manager, ask your CIO, what are we doing to address income inequality? Just ask the question. And that question will guide what your next step is. I think what you'll find out may really surprise you. They may not have an answer. They may give you, a lot of, kind of portfolio and investment information. And then I think you should suggest that someone from TIIP come and provide some education to the fund trustees. And now, seriously, I think that, asking a question really opens the door for more engagement at the fund level. So that would be my first thing.
I just also want to echo referencing TIIP in the near term as soon as possible, and checking out the guide.
Mm-hmm. And with that, we'll let Bill close us out on this question.
I don't even think I have to respond. I feel like Renee, but just to say, put a point. I mean, the guide is free. It's out there, and it provides not only a kind of deeper description of the different steps that investors can take and kind of making that movement from conventional to sustainable to system level, but it also has rich with examples of investors doing things. It's not perfect. There's definitely gray spaces on the map that still have to be colored in by all of our efforts. But I think that if you just need a primer to kind of get you going, that's where it's at. And then, there are a number of things which I think you're going to highlight that obviously TIIP is doing, and PDI is doing, and SEIU is doing. So there's a lot of us that are doing things. But yeah, read the guide. It's there. And there are op-ed length versions if people are really busy. So there's a lot of opportunities to digest the information.
Thank you so much, Bill. And with that, I do want to share a few additional opportunities from this group. So Asaba, if you could bring up our last slide here. I'm going to use moderator privileges here to do a quick summary of what we've got. Apologies for the text heavy slide, but feel free to take a screenshot to capture this for your own records. But on both the topics of income inequality and systemic stewardship more broadly, ICCR, TIIP, Predistribution Initiative, and others are really kind of building this ecosystem as we're in it, right? So a few upcoming events we want you all to know about. Next week, ICCR is co-hosting a roundtable with the Responsible Asset Allocator Initiative on corporate political spending and systemic risk. This will include an interview with SEC Commissioner Allison Lee and an expert panel to discuss these issues. So Asaba will drop the link in the chat for where you can register for that. TIIP also has an upcoming roundtable on investor responses to systemic risks. You could contact Monique Aiken at TIIP for more information there. And then there's some more opportunities for participation and collaboration that we've outlined. Delilah already touched on TIFTI. There's ways to just learn more and also publicly express your support as an ally or become more involved in this co-creation process that Delilah outlined before. She's also co-hosting or co-leading the ICCR member-led Systemic Stewardship Group, which is an ICCR member initiative to really get together with other members to advance the work that ICCR members are already doing on systemic stewardship and really build capacity with peer investors on this. Our next meeting will be March 21st at 2 p.m. And then lastly, we didn't talk about this yet, Bill, so I don't know if you want to give a quick shout out to your new sale platform and speak about that opportunity.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So this is coming out of the completion of this industry needs assessment and trying to identify what folks need and what we heard from folks about to move the needle. And two things came. This is what's embedded in this sale platform. Part of it is this kind of plug and play / turnkey solution, takes you through all the steps, provides templates, background guidance, all the stuff that you might need to launch a few analysts on for a couple of months. We do it all in very digestible fashion, so you can actually build your strategy document for system level investing. The other side of it is a community of practice where it's really meant to start to facilitate information, sharing of best practices, and co-creation of innovations that really is meant to be a bolt-in for all the different associations and activities that folks are doing as a kind of clearinghouse for bigger collective action. And we welcome people to join us for that.
So in summary, this is going to be a collaborative effort to address these issues as we've all talked about. So we welcome folks on this call and any other peers to join in this work. And so with that, I do want to make sure we address some of the questions that have come up in the chat and the Q&A. So first, this is a question for Renee about how does SEIU ensure the candidates that you endorse, I guess for the board, as Jim's question is framed, how do you ensure they are educated on the issues of DEI and how to implement ideas that move the needle? How do you kind of do that due diligence to vet your candidates?
Yeah, they're asking how do we ensure that candidates for,
I guess the way I perceive this question, directors that SEIU will support, I guess, of your portfolio companies, how to ensure that they basically walk the walk on these issues that we've talked about today, and that they're able to implement ideas that move the needle on income inequality or other systemic issues.
for board seats on companies?
I think Jim left, so I don't know if he can clarify his question in the chat,
so,
but we'll go with that.
Yeah, we'll go with that. So we look at the recommendations from the proxy advisors. We look at, how they've acted or reacted. And sometimes we may, depending on, our specific interest in the company, not clearly, we can't talk to everybody, but, we look at the board overall, quite frankly. And we look at, if the particular board member has oversight, and if the company is not performing at a level, or we've engaged with the company and we feel like they haven't performed well or haven't, really been engaging with us well, then that might lead us to us not supporting them or actually advocating for a vote no. So yeah.
Thank you.
But we do try, anywhere we have, Oftentimes we have workers reach out to members of the board to see if they will meet with them if there's a particular issue. If they refuse, that would be a big red flag for us as well.
Mhm. Thank you for that, Renee. And some of those, the looking at the board as a whole and taking that more holistic view brings back up a question that we talked a little bit about earlier that Delilah, I would want to know if you can expand on, how investors, need to be thinking beyond just public equities in their portfolio, how they should be thinking about income inequality across their whole portfolio, but also their internal activities. So are there examples you can share of what that looks like that PDI is kind of helping advocate for?
Sure. Yeah, one of the areas of focus that we have is with private equity. We started with a very heavy focus on private equity, although we realized that asset class can't change unless you look at it in the context of the entire portfolio and other asset classes as well. But in leverage buyout private equity, I don't want to take up a ton of time going through this, but one of the main strategies to generate returns is often putting significant debt on the company at the portfolio company level. And we're exploring how, if companies are overburdened with too much leverage, then they might not be in a position to offer quality jobs and quality and affordable goods and services. And so you see situations like what happened with the Toys R Us bankruptcy a few years ago. And workers were disadvantaged until LP stepped in and actually insisted that workers be adequately compensated in that restructuring. You also see situations in public equities where companies take on significant debt. And I think it's important for investors to keep in mind that engaging with your private equity GPs or fund managers is not where this kinds of engagement stops. You also have to look at your own appetite for high yield debt, your high yield bond portfolio. Are you exposed to leverage loans and collateralized loan obligations? I mean, that's the other side of these deals. And think about how you're allocating capital across these asset classes. Another area, and it's very difficult. There aren't very clear right answers. And right now, in a low interest rate environment, it's very attractive to be in. I know we're saying interest rates are going to rise, but probably not that much. So it's very attractive to be in private equity. It's attractive to be in residential housing. And we have to think about, is institutional investor to residential housing and buying up existing housing stock competing with individual homeowners and exacerbating inequality. So this stuff shows up all over the place. So I'll stop there. Yeah, I know we're
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And it surfaces the need to ask these questions, as Renee said, as a starting place, but across the entire portfolio and getting into the details of that. I'm going to tee up Bill for this last question, because I think it really speaks to the need and opportunity of the TIIP framework and guide. And the systemic stewardship lens. But there's a question here that says, is there a hesitancy to start folding in a framework that includes worker inequity when a lot of success of ESG investing approaches has come from overweighting investments in sectors like tech, which haven't historically had a good track record on pay equity and worker rights? Yeah,
so I think that anything that requires more work, I think there's hesitancy, but I do think that something that Renee kept saying about, I've heard it as racial equity audits, but also civil rights audits. Really, that was like a big theme that kept coming up at the Council on Institutional Investors that just happened this week in DC. I think that more and more what the pandemic didn't create these problems, but it certainly intensified the scrutiny on them and the ways that we need to reconsider how we approach addressing these issues at a more fundamental level. So I think that for the broader market, yeah, there's still hesitancy, but I do think for those that are the early adopters that they are moving the needle here and pushing for more and more. I had a conversation with one of the asset owners there where he said, look, I'm asking tough questions. And he's like, and I want to acknowledge that you've made a lot of progress to the companies that they work with. It's like, well, I'm going to keep asking these questions because you have to keep going further. You have to keep trying for more. And I think that, it's a credit to the work that PDI is doing. It's a credit to what Renee is doing. The examples that are being set by a lot of folks basically show like it is possible to go beyond just weighting and overweighting and underweighting, right? And that you need to if you're actually going to fundamentally solve these things. So yes, hesitancy, but I think it's early days. And I think that's going to give way to the larger acknowledgement that we have to do it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Bill, for that. Speaks to the opportunity that we have. So we welcome everyone on the call today to join us collectively in this effort. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Josh and JR for joining us earlier. But we are at time, so we will close out this webinar. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.